Hello, everyone, and welcome to Not Your Granny's Opera Podcast. I am your host, Mike Heitman, and today is the very first real episode of the podcast. Here's what we have in store today. I'm going to kind of format each episode fairly similar with, first of all, the intro and welcome, which you have just so gloriously partaken of. Then shout-outs for the week, which are, of course, things that I see that need to be highlighted that companies are doing, or particular composers or singers and all that. Things that I just think people need to hear more about that I thought were really cool. The second segment is Colline's Corner, which is an educational segment of the podcast. Of course, Colline is the philosopher in La Boheme, and so I figure if I'm going to be educating people, I should have some kind of feeling of not educational. I just feel I should be smart. Okay, there's the word. Which clearly I'm doing an awesome job of coming off as really smart right now. I think so too. And then the last part of the podcast will of course be the topic of the week, which may be an interview. It may be just whatever I feel like talking about. It could also be an opera synopsis. And going into the different characters that are in these operas, how they're traditionally portrayed, and how perhaps we can modernize them. Shout out for the week. This week, of course, you can see that I have a Seattle Opera shirt on, and I want to give a shout out to my friends and over at Seattle Opera. They, of course, opened the magnificent opera masterpiece Porgy and Bess this last weekend. To raving reviews from what I've heard from my friends that went and saw it. The actual reviews in the normal Seattle Times and Broadway World and all that haven't come out yet, so I can't see how the other people have thought of it, but it seems to have been a really powerful production, and I want to give them a shout out for that because they're taking on a piece that is very culturally relevant. I mean, you can't really talk about American opera without mentioning Porgy and Bess. You do anyone learning about American opera a disservice if you don't bring it up. It has wonderful music. In terms of their production, I used to work there. In full disclosure, I don't anymore, so I don't really feel there's a conflict of interest, but I just think it's really cool that they're doing the show. And so I have friends in it, but also some of the people who are singing the principal roles I've done other shows with while I was at Seattle Opera, including Alfred Walker, Mary Elizabeth Williams, and Angel Blue. And they are just fabulous colleagues, amazing singers, and so I can only imagine that it was a very powerful performance. I will put some links in the description below of places you can go to check out their promotional videos for Colline's Corner. Today we're going to talk about the wonderful topic in opera that is suicide. Those of us who are familiar with opera, we know that death is just an integral part of it. It's an integral part of life. But a lot of times in opera, you die because of sickness. I mean, there's so many things that opera singers can die of. I mean, we have tuberculosis, obviously suicide, and in our modern times a lot of opera singers die of exposure because that's all a lot of people think that we should be paid. But we're going to talk about suicide because there are some trends in opera, and these are just kind of interesting facts, I think. So I would say one of the more common ones in opera, aside from a medical way to die in terms of suicide, is to jump out of things. So first of all, we know that people like to jump from buildings. So the first one, of course, infamously, is Tosca. In Tosca, she jumps off a parapet. Zenta jumps off a cliff when she finds out that she has to go and be with Eric because she wants to be with the Dutchman. Of course, that's from Flying Dutchman. Katia Kavanova jumps into the Volga River. And also Lisa in Peak Dame. Number 2, you can stab yourself. So of course, Ernani stabs himself, Dido and Les Troyens. The most interesting one to me is Lucretia and the Rape of Lucretia, because for those of you who aren't familiar with the Rape of Lucretia, long story short, Lucretia is the wife of the head of the Roman army, and Collatinus. And one night, Junius and Collatinus, who are also leaders in the Roman army, and Tarquinius, who is a leader in the army, not as high as Collatinus and Junius, but he also is of nobility. And he's a douchebag of epic proportions, because what ends up happening is the three of them get drunk. They're complaining about their women. Junius is like, our women are never faithful when we go off to war. And Collatinus is like, no, Lucretia, she's mine. She doesn't mess around. And Tarquinius is like, hold my beer. And he rides off and tries to seduce her to prove a point. Now, he does end up trying to rape Lucretia, but she wakes up before anything really, really happens. But she feels so terrible about it that she kills herself in front of Collatinus and everyone else. So it's a really, really tragic way when, of course, she's the victim. It would have made more sense if she stabbed Tarquinius. Now, here's just some odd ones. Going to that stabbing thing, one of the most famous ones is Cho-Cho-san, or Madame Butterfly. She, of course, here's a way to welcome your husband home. He comes back after 3 years and she kills herself. Now, granted, she does have a pretty good reason, because Pinkerton, of course, they fall in love when he's at war. He's in the U.S. Army, or the U.S. military. And he eventually leaves her. They have a baby that he doesn't even know about. And then he comes back to Japan, bringing Kate Pinkerton, his wife. And so, because of all of this and many things, Cho-Cho-san kills herself. Here's one way that opera is modern. A recent show, Two Boys, which is by Nico Muli, it premiered in 2010. This one, Jack arranges his own death over the internet. Another one is Seneca from the Coronation of Poppaea. He dies in a bathtub. Magda in Menotti's The Council, so this is a 20th century opera. She puts her head in a gas oven. And then the last one is the best way to celebrate Christmas, and that is Werther shooting himself on Christmas Eve. Yay, Santa! So those are some tidbits for the week about suicide in opera. Let's go to the topic of the day, which is kind of my MO in this whole entire thing. I just wanted to give you my philosophies on modernization and why we need to do this. The main thing with modernizing opera is not just to put butts in seats. It's not just to make more money. It is to make this art form that is so potentially powerful, even more powerful than it already is. We already have a fair amount of people in the United States who go to these operas despite the fact that they're not in their native language, that they're doing this all night looking at surtitles. It's because the music and the acting and the singing is so powerful. Okay, so how then can we make this more effective? Because we hear constantly, opera's dying, you're donating, the people who donate the most, they're all old, and they're all going to die, and you're not really doing very much to incorporate a new audience. That is all on us. There are some very simple things that we can do to make opera more accessible. A lot of the major stereotypes of opera are, it's too expensive, which you can debate that. I mean, when I started Opera Muse in Seattle, I personally know that they are selling Seahawks tickets for nosebleeds for well over what the amount of an orchestra ticket is for opera. And like Beyonce, one time I looked up just to do some research, and like they were doing a Beyonce show, and it was like $1,000 for essentially an orchestra level ticket. I'm like, really? You're gonna tell me that opera is super expensive? It's not that it's expensive, it's that you don't value it as much as you would these Beyonce tickets. Now, that's a fair argument. So then we're like, okay, well, then we need to figure out a way to make it either cheaper or make it more valuable in their minds. Okay? So number one is price. Number two, like I kind of mentioned, is language barrier. I totally get it. I personally don't like listening to entire operas in their native language unless I know the story. I do not enjoy looking at surtitles at a theater or subtitles if I'm watching it online all night. Most people, they don't want to do that kind of effort. Why would they do so much mental effort and extra effort when they could go see a movie? They could just chill at home. Whether we like it or not, most people in the world, not the world, the United States are lazy. And I don't mean that in the they don't work hard. But when it comes to when they finally settle down from all their responsibilities like work and their family and they have their own downtime, most of them, I think, go for the path of least resistance. And so if there are all these walls that are legitimately there or even just preconceived, then they're not going to do it. You know, yeah, they're going to pay literally double or more to go see a comedy show, a concert that's in their native language. So it's on us to help break down those barriers. Number three, it's elitist. I'm so sick of this argument. I honestly am. Because opera is not elitist. It never was meant to be elitist, I don't think. And the most effective operas that we have in the repertoire are not elitist. So there's something there. Those are kind of the main things. So it's price, elitism, language, and just how it's perceived. So we have to, as artists and as producers, figure out a way to connect with our audience, especially our younger audiences, better. So here is how you do it, in my view. Number one, every company needs to find a way to effectively do outreach. And this is done many different ways. There are some organizations that specifically do this, like Opera Muse. Opera on Tap is another wonderful one that's all throughout the world. But the key ingredient to this is that it must be in English. If you're doing like a whole show. Now, if you're doing scenes and arias and you're, giving a synopsis before you sing it or having somebody talk about it, okay, that can, I guess, theoretically be in the original language. And also from a singer standpoint, it's probably just easier to do it that way. But if you're doing something that resembles an actual show, whether it be 30 minutes to 90 minutes, I think an hour is great. Most people have the attention span for an hour pretty easily with opera if you keep it up tempo and you keep the best music from the show in it. Then if you put it in English, it makes such a huge difference. And you can even do it pretty close to what the original libretto is, or you can be radical and do what I do, because otherwise you are going to lose people and you will never get that younger audience. Now, if you're going to modernize it and take it so far like I do, then you can really target a younger audience. When I wrote Don Giovanni, of course, our production was campus rape culture. I wanted to make something relevant to show how idiotic Giovanni is and how that kind of thinking it may be tempting in the short term, but it has lasting, long-term, catastrophic consequences. Both not only for the people that he seduces, but also for himself, because he gets his due. There were things that I felt needed to be said in that show. I mean, I don't get offended or anything like that when I have people groaning because of how terrible some of the things that he said were. When these things were being portrayed in front of the audience, which there was groping, there was tons of inappropriate language and just really misogynistic things said, and also very feminist things said. Those who are pro-feminism, they definitely had their rallying cries. I mean, Elvira was as stereotypical feminist as you could possibly get. I was actually really proud because when I wrote it, Sammy, who co-founded Opera Muse with me, she played Elvira, and she is a uber feminist and very, very, very proud of it, and that's good. That's great. It's all part of her personality and her life. And once she really got into studying the role, she's like, "Yeah, you really nailed it. Like, this is a little creepy how close this is to how I actually think." And I was like, "I know. It's because I know you. One, I know you, but like I watch, I try to be as informed about both sides of issues as possible. Of course, I have my opinions one way or the other, you know, with anything social, anything political. But I do try to see both sides and try to be able to argue both sides. And so with this particular show, you know, people who are feminists are like, yeah, and people who are not feminists are like, ugh, here we go again, you know, that kind of thing. So it was one of those things where it has something for everybody. And when you write something like that, then you have these people of all generations coming together and saying, look, I can relate with this character. It's not some dude who's a nobleman, that we don't have noblemen like that anymore. You know, there's Elvira, who's a feminist. In our version, we had the commendatora instead of the commendatore. The commendatora was the dean of students, and of course she was caught in the middle of all this because she knows how terrible Giovanni is, because she's been dealing with him for a long time. She hasn't been able to actually catch him, and she also doesn't want any kind of sex scandal going around on her campus, because we all know how social media is and how those firestorms start, and then people stop coming to your school. There's that, and then of course Leporello is Giovanni's friend, and he knows how terrible this is, but he also is stuck because Giovanni is helping fund his education. I'm sure all of us have been in situations where we either A, have a friend that we know is doing something terrible, and we're trying to tell them not to do it, because he does try, like, I don't understand why you're doing this, and you're terrible, you need to stop. Before bad things happen, but at the same time, our relationship with that person, maybe there's an advantage there. Maybe it's not necessarily a friend, but maybe it's a colleague at work, that they, sometimes you get in positions where your morals can be compromised. Of course, there's Seralina, and our Anna and Seralina were the same person. The first scene is the only scene where Don Anna is in the show, and it's just basically to show that, you know, he's having his conquest, and then it of course doesn't work out. And then Seralina, from there on, you know, she has a boyfriend, and it just shows that Giovanni doesn't care who you are. He just wants to have sex with you. He doesn't have any real moral compass. His only thing is he wants to, you know, pursue pleasure. And she's stuck because she tries to, she's not dumb, but she does fall for him. And then she realizes the error of her ways, and then she bands together with Elvira and the Commendatora to help bring him down. All of those things combined that make it a much more engaging show than what it traditionally is. The music is just so outstanding that we can't let the message, because it's too old or not really relatable, make that the thing that takes people away. And that would be the saddest thing. I also say a lot is, you still have a problem if you think a modern production of something, but you still do it in its original language, is fixing the problem. Like, yes, a fancy production is like going and getting a used car that has a brand new paint job, but under the hood is still a hot mess. It looks good on the surface. It will draw some attention that may not otherwise be there, but it still is going to have all those issues of looking at surtitles, language. It's really important that if you're going to update things, you need to go all the way. You need to do it in English. I mean, if they have surtitles, why not give those things to the singers? Like, I don't get that. Because here's the problem we have, is that if you're doing it in the original language, especially if it's a comedy, There are obviously jokes in there, otherwise it wouldn't be a comedy. However, with how language works, and if a company is putting in some modern references to give it a little bit of modern flair, like I've seen, the jokes that you've learned in the original language happen at different places in the sentence. So like they get to the joke well before you get there. And that's just weird. It really is. It's so weird as a performer, you know. If I'm telling you a joke like knock knock and you're like, who's there? And they're already laughing, you haven't even gotten to the punchline. Doesn't make sense. I realize part of the reason why they don't do this is because it's a little bit more work for the singers. And it's really nice to be comfortable in just learning a role all the way through, regardless of the size of it, and just going around and singing that the whole time. But we don't live in a country yet that is multilingual enough in those singing languages to where that's really a good idea in the United States. In Europe, totally get it. Moving on, we have price. I think that you can do a lot with the production that you're doing in terms of what kinds of costumes you have, where you place it, the venue, the amount of singers, and depending on how savvy you are, it doesn't diminish the value of the production because it should be about the story and the singing, not the flash of a costume or something like that. Here's the great thing about adapting and putting in English. You cut out all the unnecessary stuff. Also, just look at the venues you're in. Are you constantly selling out a 500-seat auditorium, a 1,000-seat auditorium, a almost 4,000-seat auditorium, Metropolitan Opera? If you are, awesome. Keep doing what you're doing. If you're not, then find a way to either go into a smaller venue to where it's, I mean, honestly, smaller venues are just so much better for everyone. I would much rather have to add performances because it's sold out than to worry about overhead. You know, some of my favorite places to perform or to, especially as an audience member, to go see things are ones that are under 1,000 seats. I honestly don't think you need more than 1,000 seats. In terms of the elitist attitude, there's nothing really I can say about that other than don't be that way. Well, that's the podcast for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, going over some of the things about modernizing opera and some of my thoughts about that. Again, I'm going to put links in the description to check out Porgy and Bess at Seattle Opera. I hope that you guys, will check that out. And if you like this content and this concept that we're going for, definitely check out my Patreon to help support me if you feel so inclined. And I'll talk to you next week.